It's almost banlist time once again, and in this video I want to go over what I think should and might get hit on the upcoming ban list. Now keep in mind, as with all banlist videos, this is just my opinion and my opinion only. You're free to disagree, just please do so civilly. Also, the way I'm structuring this video is going to be slightly different than your typical banlist prediction video, where typically I would just be saying, oh, I think this card should get hit, or this card might get hit. Instead, for each of these cards that I'm going to be talking about today, I'm going to be talking about what I think a potential hit could look like. So just keep in mind that I'm not saying like all these cards should be hit at the same time. I'm just saying if we were to hit these decks or these cards, then this is one way that they could do it. So with all that being said, let's hop straight into it, starting off with potential Dracotail hits. Of course, Dracotail is still one of the best decks that we have in the current format, so I do think it needs to get additional hits. But one potential hit I haven't really seen anyone talk about is actually just straight up banning Dracotail or Arthalion. And I know that sounds kind of strange because this is kind of the heart and soul of the deck, and the deck might actually just not be playable after it gets hit. But honestly, I think that there is some merit to having this card be hit, because inherently being able to add any monster back from the graveyard is kind of unfair. For a lot of decks, you can loop hand traps, things like that. You can basically add any generic monster back from the graveyard, and is one of the factors contributing to Dracotail's current success. Of course, that being said, there's also some world where like Arthalion just gets a potential limit as well. Even though the deck only plays 2 Arthalion at the moment, losing out on the second one is actually pretty big, because now it means the Dracotail player kind of has to decide like what they're putting back with their trap cards. They have to decide whether they can put back the one of Ketsu or put back the one of Arthalion in this case. Or in some other cases, just forego putting back the traps with the other traps as well. So it makes it so the grind game of Dracotail is a little bit more hindered this way. But ultimately, I think that there is some world where we could see Arthalion get hit, and I don't think this would be a terrible way to hit Dracotail necessarily. Now, maybe a little bit more of a standard way to hit Dracotail is actually with Rahu Dracotail, putting that to 1. This is not only big for the deck because it reduces its consistency, but it also makes it so the Dracotail cards themselves actually inherently just get weaker. Every Dracotail monster, in order to get its like bonus effect, does need to be able to successfully set a Dracotail spell or trap directly from the deck. And if they only have 1 copy of Ketsu, 1 copy of Rahu, and the 3 traps, well, there's only 5 of those cards I think is set from the deck. So over the course of a game, if these cards get stuck in the graveyard, for example, with your opponent like hand trapping the Dracotail trap cards, it can be really difficult for the Dracotail deck to grind, and it can make it so all the Dracotail effects don't really actually exist because they won't have anything to set from the deck. If this were to happen, Dracotail players might be forced to play multiple copies of the trap cards, which of course is not very optimal in voice second, or just optimal in general since you're more likely to hard draw them, and you don't really want that. But overall, I think that whether we get an Arthalion hit or a Rahu hit, I think ultimately the Dracotail deck does still need to see some hits on this upcoming list just because of how dominant it is in the current format. Next up, we're going to talk about the Yummy deck. The first card I want to talk about is Cup's Yummy Way. I think there's some potential for this card to actually be banned. And now, hear me out. I know this is one of the heart and soul of the Yummy deck. And if you were to hit this, then basically Yummy just becomes like this self-contained engine where I have to basically draw 2 Yummy cards or like hard draw my best Yummy names in order for me to really get going with the Yummy deck. I think one potential reason this card could get banned is because of how easily bridgeable it is from like other engines. Any engine that's able to put out a Link 1 and level 1 monster can instantly go into this, and then Cup's Yummy Way alone becomes full Yummy combo. So I think that's one potential way to hit Yummy. Yes, it would be a pretty significant hit, and I definitely think it would impact the Yummy deck's viability, but I wouldn't put this out of the realm of possibility just because of how dominant and how easily splashable the Yummy engine is. Another maybe more like normal hit to Yummy could just be limiting Cup's Yummy. It takes 2 hand traps in order to stop this card from being like a combo at all. If the Yummy player is able to hard draw, they're not as vulnerable to hand traps like Ash Blossom on their Cup's Yummy Way or things like that. So I think limiting Cup's Yummy would not only reduce the consistency of the Yummy deck, it also reduce its ability to play through hand traps. Another potential hit could be the Yummy Field Spell. I don't personally think this is going to happen, but I think there is some world where you can make the argument that, okay, if we are able to ban this Field Spell, then the Yummy deck becomes a 2-card combo deck, because without the Field Spell, like a single Yummy name turning into statue is not going to really get anywhere. I think ultimately this probably is very unlikely to happen, but I did want to briefly talk about it because I think it is something that is still within the realm of possibility. Forcing players to basically choose between like, oh, do I play Yummy as a pure deck and play a bunch of Yummy names, or just make it so like, oh, I can't really splash Yummy anymore because a single Yummy monster is not necessarily going to get me where I need to. On a related note to Yummy, I think Hornet Drone is still something that's worth talking about. This is one of the main ways that people bridge into the Yummy engine. They'll make Camellia. Camellia will dump Hornet Drones to the grave. Then Camellia will turn to Kagari to add back drones. And then you have any Yummy synchro after that. I think if Cup's Yummy Way or Minion, like either one of those get hit, there isn't really a need to hit Hornet Drones. But if Konami doesn't really want to hit like the Yummy cards directly, I think that there is some world where Hornet Drones does get banned. It's going to suck for Skytracker, which did just get like new cards in the legendary decks. But overall, I just think that a card like Camellia enabling the bridge so easily is just not something that we should have in the game. It makes it so Yummy can basically splash into any deck that can make a generic link 2, which is pretty much every deck in the game. The next card I want to talk about is Canine Ripper. I think that this is something that definitely does warrant getting hit. Not only is it a generic bridge from any rank 5 deck into the K9 deck, it also makes it so any rank 5 deck can set up a super easy negate for hand traps like Nibiru or Ash really early on in their combo, making it really hard to stop them. Out of all the cards I talked about so far, this is probably the most realistic one I can see happening. I don't think it's going to kill the K9 deck outright. Overall, I think that a card like this does really need to go because of that kind of gameplay it promotes. Izuna, I think, is something you could make some argument for limiting as a hit to the K9 deck if you don't want to hit like a card like Ripper directly. But ultimately, I think that Izuna is not like a particularly unfair card by any means. It's a solid hand trap. But ultimately, the reason why a card like Izuna I think is really broken is because it's super accessible off of a card like Ripper. So if you were to limit Izuna in theory, it may not actually change anything because your opponent still has a searchable hand trap as a way to not only protect their combo, but also as a way to interrupt you on your following turn if a card like Ripper still exists. My point is, I don't think that Izuna is a super unfair card, especially if we remove Ripper from the equation. And then next up for the Radiant Typhoon deck, I think there are a couple of ways you can argue for this deck to get hit. The first one is going to be for the core engine itself, being cards like Swen, Eldum, cards like Chant. Personally, I don't think Radiant Typhoon's a super dominant deck by any means. It's a good deck, and it is pretty relevant, but ultimately, I don't think it's dominant to the point where it actually warrants getting a big hit like this to their consistency, because this deck is already something that struggles with it. However, on the other hand, there is also the argument that cards like Chant, cards like Eldum, and Swen are being used as a generic engine in some decks, and it can make it really hard to interrupt them because these cards are pretty good at like just putting bodies on the board and forcing out hand traps from the opponent. So I think there is some world where we could see a potential limit to one of the Radiant Typhoon cards being Swen or Chant, but personally I don't think it's something that's super likely to happen. And then we got Radiant Typhoon Vision. I want to talk about this card specifically too, because it is one of those cards that can potentially be abused generically. I don't think having the option to like just draw to discard one is super broken by any means in the current metagame, but there is that argument where like, okay, it's generic enough to potentially warrant getting hit because it gives a lot of decks this extra added layer of consistency that it shouldn't have. Personally though, I don't think this is something that is going to get hit. I think having a generic draw card like this is not necessarily bad for the game by any means. And then next up, we gotta talk about Maliss. Even after getting White Binder banned, this deck is still popping off and doing really well. And so I think maybe it warrants like one final hit to kind of just sweep it under the rug and have everyone move on from like playing the deck. I guess the best solution I can really think of is probably putting White Rabbit to 1. Not only does this further affect Maliss's consistency, it also pretty heavily weakens a card like Allure Darkness in the deck, since there will be so many fewer good targets to like banish off Allure. You'll have 3 copies of Chesty Cat, which is pretty good, 1 copy each of Dormouse and White Rabbit, which of course are good, and then 3 copies of Marcher, which is like okay, but not great. So overall, I think that hitting White Rabbit to 1 will make that Maliss like even more volatile than it currently is, and should give players a reason to sort of start moving away from it, at least the super serious ones, because this deck will just be a lot less consistent now with 1 copy of White Rabbit. Red Ransom is also something that I could see getting hit in Maliss. If they don't want to hit White Rabbit, they could just straight up ban Red Ransom. And honestly, I think that banning Red Ransom outright would just straight up kill the deck. I don't think there is any way for them to really combo without this card, especially without a card like White Binder 2. So if they really want to make sure Maliss is dead, then you could just ban Red Ransom. But personally, I don't think they're going to do that. They might just be more likely to limit White Rabbit or something like that. Next up, we got the Mitsurugi cards. Mitsurugi Prayers, I think, is a pretty big one that could be on the chopping block. Not only would it reduce the consistency of the Mitsurugi deck, it actually makes it so the Mitsurugi engine is a lot less splashable. And the reason for that, I'll explain, is because if, for example, you have to start with Mitsurugi Prayers, that Prayers is basically gone forever until you can Kusanagi it back. The people who like are splashing the Mitsurugi cards aren't necessarily always playing Kusanagi. This could start forcing them to play a card like that in the deck if they want to splash it, or just force them to pivot away from the engine entirely, since playing those extra bricks like Kusanagi is not necessarily worth it. It also makes it so Kusanagi's it also makes it so the decisions relating to Kusanagi are a little bit more important. Now you have to decide between whether I'm adding back the Mitsurugi Ritual to keep popping off, or I'm adding back the one of Prayers that I had to start with to have an interruption on my opponent's turn. Ultimately, I think that this is something that could potentially see a limit, but I do think this is a little bit of a harsh hit to Mitsurugi. So another potential option could be like pre-preparation of rights. Like I could see this card also potentially getting limited as a hit to Mitsurugi, but not necessarily as a direct hit to like the engine itself. With only 1 copy of preparation of rights, it's probably not going to be worth it to play just the 1 copy and the Mitsurugi Mirror as a brick to add like 1 extra starter to the deck. this should make the Mitsurugi engine a little bit less accessible. It'll basically force you to be playing more of a pure version where you're able to see the cards more often. Or if you, for some reason, still want to continue playing Mitsurugi as an engine, it's just going to be seen less often with less copies of this card. So overall, either hitting limiting prayers or limiting pre-prep, I think could be a reasonable hit to the Mitsurugi deck. Prayers would be a little bit more harsh because it is a direct hit to like the Mitsurugi end board, whereas pre-prep is just a slight hit to the consistency and maybe slashability of the engine. And then lastly, for the last deck-specific card I want to talk about is Lunalight Liger Dancer. You can argue that Lunalight is not like doing anything in this metagame, and I'd agree. It's a deck that's like on the fringe, that like sees a top here or there. When you look at the Lunalight gameplay, it essentially is like an FTK deck. Yes, your opponent gets a chance to play. Yes, they're out to the Liger Dancer. But ultimately, if you've ever played against Lunalight or played Lunalight, you know the goal of the deck is just to spit out Liger Dancer and just say like, okay, do you have it out to this card? If you don't, I'm just going to win the game. It's pretty different from like the other combo decks that we have in the game right now where, yes, they're setting up big boards that are pretty hard to break inherently. But overall, there is still some world where those boards like can be broken with just like normal engine or normal non-engine that people are playing. Whereas on the other hand, like Lunalight Liger Dancer requires very specific outs to be played in people's decks, whether that be like Kaijus or Herald of the Abyss or something like that. So in some sense, you can make the argument that like Lunalight is a quote-unquote FTK deck that shouldn't be in the game. So there is some world where I could see like Liger Dancer getting banned, but maybe a more realistic like middle-of-the-road approach could just be to limit Liger Dancer instead. And this is going to seem weird because like, well, they still have the card, like they're still going to go for that game plan. But having only one Liger Dancer versus the two that they have right now could actually be a big deal, because now it means like once that single Liger Dancer is gone, there isn't really a way for them to summon another one. So all the like quote-unquote outs that people were playing before, like let's say Brand Fusion into Titaniclad, are now pretty reasonable outs if they only have one copy. So personally, I don't think they have to hit the Lunalight deck because it's not a super popular or meta relevant deck at the moment. But I think just this gameplay loop of like, okay, I'm setting up my one big monster that you're never going to be able to out, is something that shouldn't necessarily be in the game. And I think it could warrant getting hit because of that reason. And then next up, I also wanted to talk about some generic board pieces. Dragoon, I think, is a pretty big one with the new Dark Magician, a fusion monster. Being able to easily like splash that into any big spellcaster deck and just put an Omni Negate on the board really early is something that I also don't think is super healthy for the game. It makes it so those decks are almost impossible to hand trap, especially with cards like Nibiru, which are normally supposed to punish those like decks from popping off. Ultimately, I think it falls in a similar boat as a Cannon Ripper. It's just too easily accessible at the moment with the new Dark Magician stuff, and I don't think every deck that plays a big spellcaster should just have a super easy way to access like a big Omni Negate end piece. In a similar vein, I also think High King Caesar should also potentially be banned, except this time it's for the Fiendsmith engine. With a card like Caesar, you could just splash Fiendsmith into any combo pile and just have it be resistant to Nibiru, because as long as you're able to access the Fiendsmith engine first and put out 2 level 6 Fiends, well, your opponent has to Nibby there, otherwise they can't Nibby later on. But without a card like Caesar, I think if the Fiendsmith engine is just being used to summon a card like Desiree, that's totally fine. Desiree is not an unfair card by any means, it has a lot of counterplay. But I think the super unfair part of Fiendsmith is the fact that they have access to Caesar. So ultimately, I think that all of these ways of protecting the combo deck early on in their combo from like hand traps like Nibiru should probably just not be in the game, and I can see a world where all these do get banned. Callby, I think, is probably just going to stay where it is at the moment. I think this card probably should be banned personally, because it makes it so, well, going first, now your opponent has to see multiple hand traps for them to even have a chance of stopping you. It just makes it really hard to go second with a card like this. But realistically, I don't think they're going to hit it. Cards like Call by Crossout, like, yeah, it makes going first a lot better, which is not necessarily good for the game. But realistically, I don't think it's going to happen. So that's why I'll put it at like the bottom. I'll put it in the remain unhit tier. Next up, we got Floodgates. I have a picture of Dimensional Fissure here, but I think this conversation sort of extends to like all of Floodgates that we are seeing in the game right now. Cards like Different Dimension Ground, cards like Dimensional Fissure, things like that. Cards like Mistaken Arrest. I think there's some argument for all these to be banned. In next week's video, I'll also be doing a discussion on whether or not we should ban all these Floodgates, so do stay tuned for that. Or if you're watching this later on, I may have already posted it on my channel, and I will link it here once I do post that. But for now, all I'm going to say is I think there is some argument to be made for all of these Floodgate cards to be banned, and so I'll put them in the potential ban section. And then next up, we got Dimension Shifter. I think there's no reason for this card to really be at 1. It's just a huge blowout card where some decks have access to it and other decks will just straight up auto lose to it. I don't think there's a reason for this card to still be in the game. It's just one of the hardest hand traps to play around, and there realistically is no counterplay to this card. Drone Lockbird is maybe more of an interesting one. I think realistically, they're probably going to start putting it down to 1 and maybe eventually banning it. This card is not super fun to play against. If your deck is one that searches a lot, like this card can just straight up end your turn. Drone Lockbird does make going second a little bit more possible against those like combo slop decks, but I think a better way to address that issue is just to straight up make it so those combo slop decks like don't exist, or their gameplay doesn't revolve around them adding like a million cards from their deck to hand. I'm not going to get super in-depth into the discussion here in terms of whether or not Drone Lockbird should be banned. But realistically, I think that they are going to put it to this list and then maybe eventually ban it, just because of that sort of unfun gameplay loop it creates, sort of like what Dimension Shifter does right now. Fua, I don't think is going to get hit at all, or Purulia for that matter. Every good meta deck should have some counterplay to all these cards, and of course with a card like Ash Blossom being in the format, I really don't see a reason for these Charmies to get hit at all. And then lastly is specifically Fairy Tail Snow, but I guess this sort of applies to all the random cards that are still on the ban list that have no merit being there. Snow, I think in particular, has some merit to be there, because as long as any deck exists that can like mill a bunch of cards, Snow is going to be one of the best cards in the game. But the reason I want to talk about Snow specifically is because there is new Fairy Tail support that is coming out, and I think there's some potential world where they do put Snow back to 1 just to push that. But in terms of all the other cards that we have on the ban list right now, whether they're banned, limited, semi-limited, I'm sure there are cards that are on there that Konami just honestly forgot about, and those cards like could come back to the metagame without them actually impacting it at all. So for example, off the top of my head, maybe a card like Monster Reborn, which is still at 1 for some reason. Like if you put that back to 3, I don't think anyone's going to complain. But I didn't want to talk about like all of those potential cards right now, because I think most of them are not going to be particularly meta relevant. So that's going to do it for my ban list discussion / prediction. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section below. Once again, do keep in mind this is just my opinion and my opinion only. You're free to disagree. Just do so in a civil way, please. And also, because I'm sure there are going to be people who just skip straight to the end of the video just to see the tiers that I put it in. Keep in mind, I'm not saying that every single one of these hits are going to happen in conjunction with each other. For each of these cards, I put them in each of these sections because they could potentially see that happening. For example, a ban to Cupsy Yummy Way could happen, but I wouldn't say like, oh, they're going to ban Cupsy and Mignon and limit Cupsy Yummy like the main deck monster, because that doesn't really make sense. So do keep that in mind when looking at this list. This is not a list saying like all these cards are going to get banned, all these cards are going to get limited. So do keep that in mind. With all that being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.